So there's a new term that has kind of come out of nowhere, and you're hearing it a lot right now, which is code vibing. So what is code vibing?
Code vibing. Tim, you would like this. It's the intersection point between coding and artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. And quite often code vibing is being done by non-coders.
Right.
And let me tell you where I wish I knew the name of the gentleman.
So this is like this is someone says, gee, I really wish I had a Python script that did the following. And you literally go to your generative AI and say, give me a Python script that does the following.
Correct.
Yes.
You're absolutely right. So let me give you pragmatically where it seems to have started in earnest. And by the way, there's a gentleman who quoted the term. I'm going to put the name here of who coined that term, code vibing. But basically, guys of a certain age, like us, who might have grown up during the era of classic video games, for example. Video games, when we were young, looked a certain way. 8-bit, had a certain tone of music and just the way things looked. And so therefore, the video games themselves needed to be high impact because it wasn't all about the graphics and it wasn't all about the creature comforts of modern games. And so a lot of people were becoming nostalgic. Hey, what about this really old game that I played when I was a kid? Can I make something like it? And I'm not a coder, but I'm going to ask AI to help me.
Right.
And then what shocked a lot of people was all of a sudden the game appeared in front of them because AI coded it for them. And so what people have realized, and this is what this episode is about, is if you want to do this, there's a right way to do it. You don't go to your text prompt and just say, hey, when I was 12 years old, there was this game and, code it for me and expect it to just be there. It's an iterative process.
Right. As a lot of these things are, right? One of the things we've seen is there's a process, just the generative AI, where you write a prompt, you get a result, and then depending on what you're doing with it, oftentimes you're trying to modify the result to get something that's closer to what you're ultimately seeking. And one of the ways you do that is you iteratively update the prompt, right?
Precisely. Like, for example, if you were to, just conceptually try to make a game of checkers or chess, well, you got to start with the board.
Right.
The board and how it's designed would take a certain amount of coding. And then there's each of the player characters and how they're shaped, and you get that coded in. And then there's, well, what are the rules of the game and how do the shapes move across the board and how do they interact and what are the rules, right? And each one of those would be an iteration of what you're asking AI to help you with and code. Now, what I've found is that quite often there are big advancements in AI recently, especially with regards to context windows. Okay. For those of you who are into AI, there have been some large language models that have offered up very large context windows, which allows you then to put in the entire code base into your prompt and say, improve on this, and this is what I want. Mm-hmm. And some of the best code vibers are also, for lack of a better term, are also utilizing AI to actually help them to develop the prompts. In other words, it's hard to think of every rule, and so therefore, why not let AI help you to develop the rules of whatever it is that you're doing?
Why not? Absolutely.
So AI is great at it. And in fact, some people, I've seen full-blown, really cool flight simulators that people have built, code vibing. And these are not generally professional developers or people who even code much at all. And some people are just absolutely non-coders who've simply used natural English prompts and this method and this workflow of iterating and gotten something that's quite sophisticated.
Yeah.
And it's just great.
Yeah.
Now, why are we bringing it up on this episode? In this podcast, Root Causes. It's because I challenged myself to do something that I did many years ago, Tim.
Okay.
Which was to create a web browser.
Okay.
And so I'm going to talk to you about the code vibing piece of that. And then I think we'll break into another episode where we'll actually talk about the browser itself.
Sure.
So I wanted to code vibe a web browser of my own. And it's not hard to do. The reason why it's not hard to do is because the rendering engines that are underneath all of our popular browsers today are readily available.
Right. Yep.
In fact, this was my challenge, my code vibing challenge to myself. I was over a weekend. It was raining. It was just terrible weather. And I said, I got some time here. Okay, 2 hours. I'm going to create a text-based browser, not unlike, I don't know how many of you are old enough to know Lynx, Lynx,
Okay.
which was a text-based browser on Unix systems back in the middle and early 1990s. And the Lynx-based browser was kind of an advancement upon what CERN had done with their original World Wide Web hypertext protocol pages, which was all the rage in the early 1990s, because you didn't just have Telnet going into a computer system and then running a few commands. You now had highly information-rich pages over the internet that you could browse essentially with your arrow keys and click on keywords, hypertext protocol, and be able to then get another information-rich page. And that was amazing. And then that was done through some very clever hypertext protocol work that they did through Telnet. But then people turned that into the Lynx browser, which was my first browser. And so, again, my code vibing was out of a nostalgia. Because I wanted to have text-based browsing again. And sure enough, AI, without my prompting, chose Beautiful Soup as the hypertext rendering protocol. In other words, what it was doing was, Beautiful Soup is very, very good at reading HTML and making, parsing it, making discernments about how to, you can ask it to do a lot of things with the with HTTP text once you have it fed into Beautiful Soup, to make it real simple. And so it makes for a beautiful base for a text-based browser. And sure enough, within 15 minutes, I had a completely functional text-based browser. I said, well, okay, I need to make a graphical browser now.
Right, sure.
So I'm going to tell you, the old story. The old story was way, way back in the day, back when, people very commonly programmed Microsoft COM objects. This is truly 1990s era, late 1990s era, early 2000s, when people were mostly Microsoft stack. And way back in the day, instantiated my own Internet Explorer object and then built my own UI on top of it. I wanted the address bar to be in a different location. I wanted different graphical elements. But I didn't want to write a rendering engine.
Right.
So that's just the way what you did back in late 1990s. And I found it fascinating back then for just how fast you could code that. But it was code, right? I was writing code.
Right.
I wanted to have the modern equivalent in code vibing. And so I began with Chromium. And so
Sure.
I had my own
That's good
Chromium
sense.
browser.
Right. Okay.
And I very specifically asked AI to give me a Chromium-based browser, and with some very specific elements. And we're going to get into this in the next podcast, but hey, I'm an SSL nerd, and so therefore I wanted to have SSL information up front, and I even wanted to have a green address bar whenever I hit a site with EV.
You don't like that the green address bar went away? You can just make your own.
I made my own, Tim.
There you go. Yeah.
Get off my lawn. The get off my lawn browser is what I called it.
Yes.
So I found, Tim, that the Chromium-based browser was a little bit difficult to work with, because in order to be able to do quick assessments of the SSL certificate through Chromium, I was running into issues of the Chromium sandbox. And so the Chromium sandbox, which I totally believe in, and I found out through code vibing that in order to make it do things the way I wanted to, I was going to have to degrade security of that sandbox. And I said, right there, I'm done. Thank you very much. I learned what I wanted to learn about using Chromium and customizing Chromium.
Okay.
So I moved on to Gecko.
Okay.
So therefore, I had my own Firefox-esque browser, and nothing surprising there. But then I moved on to, all right, well, I was using a MacBook, so, Mac OS, and so I wanted to try, finally, WebKit.
Okay. Sure.
And so, wow, the performance, because it was native to Mac Silicon, it was just such a quick rendering. Even quicker than Safari itself, which is essentially the same browser that, it's Apple's wrapping of WebKit 2. My get off my lawn WebKit browser was lightning fast. And I didn't run into the restrictions, Tim, of I want to have all the SSL information I can on the screen as I'm browsing. And it was nothing to code it. It took me 8 iterations. Think about that. Within 8 iterations, I had a browser that had all of the SSL certificate information rendered exactly the way that I wanted. I had advanced cookie management. I had an address bar that has special features no browser I've ever had now has. I have an incognito mode based on my own set of rules. I have it hard-coded to my own VPN.
Okay.
And a number of other things that I could get into. But these were the 8 iterations. So this is how fast, Tim, that this was coming about. And between the 7th and 8th iteration, the very final thing that I was just like, okay, I'm actually gonna do something kind of fun here. And I actually created my own root store, essentially.
You have your own root store.
So I'm going to join the cab forum and I'm going to have a vote. Just joking.
Voting member.
Joking.
Yeah.
So it was all done through code vibing, Tim.
That's crazy.
So my 2-hour challenge turned into a 4-hour challenge.
Okay.
But I ended up with 4 browsers and a root store.
Yeah. Pretty amazing. Right. And real operational browsers, like you can navigate and you can move around and it works.
So within about 1,600 lines of code, and that includes error handling and comments and like good coding practices.
Yeah.
Within 1,600 lines of code, no, I did not write WebKit 2. I did not write an HTML rendering engine, but I absolutely wrote a custom browser wrapper on top of it. And those 1,600 lines of code are entirely based off of, hey, go get me this OID in this, when you're evaluating the certificate, here's how to enumerate it.
Yeah.
That's what a lot of the code is. Plus the advanced cookie handling, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, all the code is doing is the custom stuff I actually want the get off my lawn browser to be. And that was fun, Tim.
Yeah.
And I would say to anybody, try it out.
Yeah. And crazy the power that it gives you, right? I can appreciate the viewpoint which I've heard people espouse, which is to say that's fine for I'd say a certain low level of quality needs, if you will, right? If you're doing something for yourself or it's a one-off, but, this isn't going to replace commercial software development today. I can say, correct. Yeah, sure, I can see that. But just to open up the set of projects that otherwise would never make the cut, right? There's plenty of places, times in the world where an 80-20 rule works just great, right? Or an 80-3 rule or an 81 rule, right? 80% of value for 1% of the effort. And under those circumstances, why not, right? Like you could see this becoming a real valuable addition where, yes, maybe it isn't perfect, but it is much more and better than non-existent, which is what I would have had in a pre-code vibing environment.
100%. If I had to give one idea about what is the advantage of doing code vibing,
Yeah.
professional developers, of course, are laughing at me. I'm not pretending I wrote anything that's even worthwhile to use outside of my own personal self.
Yeah.
But what I will say is, what is changing, Tim, is that the pace at which you can now learn is radical compared to what it was, because the lessons I learned in how these rendering engines actually work could never have happened if I was hand coding.
Sure.
And hand coding be darned if what all you're really doing is wanting to learn and create a proof of concept for yourself for the purposes of educating your brain. For lack of a better way of saying it, it's basically, we're going to break this into 3 podcasts, this experience, because of the fact that the amount of learning that happened was so great. So try out code vibing. And if you don't like that term code vibing, call it AI assisted application building, call it whatever you like.
Sure.
What I will say as well is that I've also code vibed a lot of other things since then. And
Okay.
not the least of which was, and we're going to have a whole podcast on this, OpenSSL put out version 3.5 of their open source software. And I challenged myself to create a private certificate authority and issue a post-quantum MLDSA certificate.
Okay.
And now that takes some scripting code to do. And I utilized AI to see how rapidly I could do it. I did it during a Zoom call over a lunch hour. So my mind was on other things, and yet I was able to code vibe a private CA.
There you go. Okay. Wow. So I think we need to return to this. I think we need to hear more about the Get Off My Lawn browser. I think we need to hear more about creating your own root store. But what a fascinating topic.
It is. We're going to do this again. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Jason.